Hi, I'm Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
The November fog of 1891 had settled upon London with the persistence of an unwelcome guest, transforming the familiar streets into a maze of grey shadows and muffled sounds. From the window of our lodgings at 221B Baker Street, I could barely make out the gaslight at the corner, its flame a pale ghost in the thick mist that seemed to swallow the very essence of the city. It was on such mornings that my friend Sherlock Holmes was wont to retreat into those profound meditations which I had learned, through long association, were as essential to his nature as breath itself. I found him that morning precisely as I had left him the evening before, save that the fire had burned low and a fresh accumulation of ash had gathered about his chair. He sat motionless in his purple dressing-gown, his long, thin fingers steepled beneath his chin, his keen grey eyes fixed upon some invisible point in the middle distance. The violin lay silent upon the table beside him, and I noted with some concern that his breakfast remained untouched upon the tray Mrs. Hudson had undoubtedly brought hours earlier. "You have been awake all night," I observed, settling into my accustomed chair and noting the peculiar intensity of his gaze. "Sleep is the cousin of death, Watson, and I find myself in no mood for family visits," he replied without shifting his position. "Besides, the fog has brought with it a most interesting problem. Observe our street below and tell me what you see." I returned to the window and peered through the murky glass. "I see very little, Holmes. The fog is impenetrable." "Precisely. And yet, 3 times in the past hour the same gentleman has passed beneath our window, each time pausing at the corner as if gathering courage for some momentous decision. A man does not brave such weather for a casual constitutional, Watson. He comes because he must, driven by circumstances that will not permit delay." Even as he spoke, the sound of hurried footsteps upon the stairs announced a visitor. Mrs. Hudson's gentle knock was followed immediately by the entrance of Inspector Lestrade, his wiry frame tense with the suppressed energy that I had come to associate with the more baffling cases that brought him to our door. "Mr. Holmes," he began without preamble, "I need your help. We have a situation in Belgravia that has left the yard completely at sea." Holmes, finally, stirred from his contemplative pose, turning his sharp features toward our visitor with the first sign of genuine interest I had seen from him in days. "Ah, Lestrade, your timing is impeccable. I was just remarking to Watson on the curious behaviour of fog-bound pedestrians. But pray take a seat and tell us what has driven you from the warmth of Scotland Yard into this atmospheric soup." Lestrade remained standing, his agitation evident in every line of his compact frame. "It's Sir Reginald Whitmore, the antiquarian, found dead in his locked study yesterday morning under circumstances that defy all rational explanation." "Locked room, you say?" Holmes inquired, his voice carrying that particular note of satisfaction that indicated his intellectual appetite had been aroused. "Locked, barred, and sealed tight as a tomb," Lestrade confirmed. "The door was bolted from the inside, the windows secured with iron grills that hadn't been disturbed, and no other means of entry or exit that we could discover. Yet there he was, dead as mutton, with a knife wound to the chest, and not a soul in sight who could have delivered it." I leaned forward in my chair, intrigued despite myself by the impossibility Lestrade described. "Surely there must be some explanation. Hidden passages, perhaps, or—" "That's just it, Doctor," Lestrade interrupted. "We've had the room examined by experts, every inch of wall, floor, and ceiling. Nothing. But here's the truly maddening part. The room contains a massive antique mirror, nearly floor to ceiling, positioned directly opposite the desk where Sir Reginald was found. According to his butler, who broke down the door when his master failed to respond to repeated summons, the mirror showed the room exactly as they found it, No signs of struggle, no fleeting shadows, nothing to suggest anyone had been there save the victim himself. Holmes rose from his chair with the fluid grace of a cat, his eyes now bright with the peculiar fire that marked the beginning of a new investigation. "A mirror, you say? How fascinating! And this mirror, was it recently acquired?" "As a matter of fact, yes. Sir Reginald purchased it just a fortnight ago from an estate sale in Venice. Quite proud of it, according to his staff. Called it the crown jewel of his collection." "Indeed." Holmes moved to the window, gazing out into the fog-shrouded street below. "And I suppose there were no witnesses to this impossible crime?" Lestrade shifted uncomfortably. "Well, that's where things become even more peculiar, Mr. Holmes. The housemaid claims she saw Sir Reginald in the study just minutes before the butler discovered the body, but she swears she saw him alive and well, standing before that very mirror as if admiring his reflection. Yet when the door was broken down, not 5 minutes later, there he was, dead at his desk with blood already beginning to congeal. Most intriguing." Holmes turned back to us, his face animated with the prospect of unravelling this seemingly impossible puzzle. "Watson, I believe we shall have need of your medical expertise. Lestrade, if you would be so kind as to arrange transportation, I think it is time we paid a visit to this remarkable mirror that appears to have witnessed a murder that could not have occurred." As I reached for my coat and medical bag, I caught sight of Holmes's reflection in the small mirror above our mantelpiece. For just an instant, something in his expression suggested that he had already begun to perceive the shape of the solution hidden within Lestrade's bewildering account. The game, as he was fond of saying, was afoot, and I found myself eager to discover what secrets lay hidden behind the silvered surface of Sir Reginald Whitmore's impossible crime. The fog swirled about us as we descended to the waiting hansom, and I could not shake the peculiar feeling that we were about to encounter a mystery where nothing would prove to be quite what it seemed, least of all the mirror that had witnessed the impossible. The hansom cab lurched through the fog-shrouded streets toward Belgravia, its wheels finding uncertain purchase on the slick cobblestone. Holmes sat in contemplative silence beside me, his long fingers drumming a complex rhythm upon his knee, while his keen grey eyes remained fixed upon some invisible point beyond the cab's grimy window. The rhythmic clatter of hooves and wheels was occasionally punctuated by Lestrade's nervous clearing of his throat, as if he wished to speak, but thought better of it. "Tell me, Lestrade," Holmes said suddenly, breaking the meditative quiet that had settled over our small party, "what manner of man was Sir Reginald Whitmore? I find that understanding the victim often illuminates the path to understanding the crime." Lestrade consulted his notebook with practised efficiency. 63 years of age, widower these past 5 years, no children, made his considerable fortune dealing in antiquities and rare artifacts with a particular specialty in mirrors and reflective surfaces from various historical periods. Bit of an eccentric, by all accounts, but highly respected in scholarly circles. His collection was said to be worth a substantial sum. "Mirrors," Holmes mused, his voice carrying that note of intellectual satisfaction I had learned to recognize. "A curious specialty indeed, and this Venetian piece he acquired recently, do we know its provenance?" "According to the dealer's records, it came from the estate of Count Alessandro Morosini, a Venetian nobleman who died under rather mysterious circumstances. The mirror was crafted over 3 centuries ago by the master glassmakers of Murano during the height of their artistry." I leaned forward, intrigued despite the chill that seemed to permeate our conveyance. "Mysterious circumstances, you say?" Lestrade shifted uncomfortably. The Count was found dead in his palazzo, apparently having suffered some sort of seizure while gazing into that very mirror. Local authorities attributed it to his advanced age, but there were whispers among the servants of strange occurrences preceding his death. "Most interesting," Holmes observed quietly. "Watson, from your medical experience, could extreme emotional trauma manifest in physical symptoms severe enough to cause death?" I considered the question carefully. "Certainly, Holmes, the human heart is remarkably susceptible to sudden shock. However, you mentioned a knife wound which would preclude natural causes." "Precisely our central paradox," Holmes agreed. "A man dies by violence in a room no one could enter or leave, witnessed only by a mirror that reflects truth, yet apparently conceals deception." The cab began to slow as we approached the fashionable district where Sir Reginald had maintained his residence. Through the dense fog, I could discern the imposing facades of great houses, their windows glowing warmly like beacons in the grey morning. Holmes leaned forward, his sharp profile etched against the window, as he studied our destination with the methodical attention of a scholar examining a rare manuscript. As we drew to a halt before an elegant Georgian townhouse, Holmes stepped down and stood motionless on the pavement, his gaze sweeping over the building's facade with that peculiar intensity that marked the beginning of his deductive process. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, nodding toward the entrance. "The steps have been recently scrubbed, save for the topmost where a patch of soot remains ground into the stone. The work was interrupted, and recently." His eyes moved upward. "Note also the black ribbon tied to the door knocker, mourning crepe, but secured with the precise hand of someone who held genuine affection for the deceased. We were admitted by a grave, middle-aged butler, whose every movement spoke of long and faithful service." "Mr. Hillier?" Lestrade informed us as the man led us through a carpeted passage toward the rear of the house. The butler's composure was admirable, though I detected the slight tremor in his hands that betrayed the shock of recent events. "The study is just here, gentlemen," Hillier said, his voice carefully modulated. "I must warn you that the door bears the marks of our forced entry. When Sir Reginald failed to respond to repeated summons, we had no choice but to break it down." Holmes paused before the damaged door, noting the splintered panels and the jagged break along the lower hinge. A smear of red sealing wax clung to the jamb where Lestrade had secured the scene. But it was the bolt mechanism that captured Holmes's attention. He knelt upon the threshold, running his finger lightly along the metal housing. "Curious?" he murmured, bringing his finger to his nose. "The bolt has been recently lubricated with graphite. Rather unusual maintenance for a mechanism seldom used by an elderly gentleman, unless someone anticipated the necessity of silent operation." He straightened, and I saw that familiar light of intellectual excitement beginning to kindle in his eyes. "Come, Watson, let us see what secrets this impossible room has preserved for us." The study door swung open to reveal a chamber that seemed to exhale the very essence of scholarly pursuit, interrupted by violence. The room was spacious and elegantly appointed, its walls lined with glass-fronted cabinets containing an extraordinary collection of mirrors from various historical periods. Persian carpets covered the polished oak floors, and heavy velvet curtains, drawn back with braided cords, framed windows secured with iron grills that had clearly remained undisturbed for months. But it was the massive Venetian mirror that commanded immediate attention, rising nearly 8 feet from floor to ceiling and dominating the far wall. Its ornate silver frame, worked with intricate scrollwork and cherubic figures, caught what little light filtered through the fog-shrouded windows. The glass itself was of remarkable clarity, presenting a perfect reflection of the room with such precision that I felt momentarily disoriented. as though peering into a parallel world. Holmes moved into the chamber with the careful precision of a surgeon, his keen eyes cataloguing every detail, while his hands remained clasped behind his back. He did not immediately approach the desk where Sir Reginald's body had been discovered, but instead began a methodical circuit of the room, his gaze sweeping over surfaces that others would consider insignificant. "The scent of Turkish tobacco lingers," he observed quietly, moving toward the cold fireplace. "Yet according to your notes, Lestrade, Sir Reginald favoured domestic cheroots." He knelt by the hearth and pinched a fragment of ash from the fender, bringing it to his nose. "This is foreign leaf, expensive, and deposited after yesterday's morning cleaning. Note how it rests upon an otherwise polished surface." Moving to the windows, Holmes tested each iron bar methodically, his fingers tracing the metal joints. "These grills have not been disturbed for months. Observe the spider's web spanning the uppermost corner, and the accumulation of dust in the joints. No recent passage here." At the massive desk, I examined the scene with my medical training. The dark stain upon the carpet told its own story of violence, and the scattered papers suggested Sir Reginald had been working when death came. "A single thrust," I observed, noting the angle and position. "Delivered with considerable precision, suggesting the attacker was familiar with anatomy." Holmes had moved to the base of the great mirror, where he knelt with his magnifying glass. "Most intriguing, Watson. Observe these minute scratches in the floorboards, fresh cuts through accumulated dust and wax. Something heavy has been moved here recently." He rose and examined the mirror's ornate frame with delicate precision. The mounting brackets show signs of recent adjustment. Fresh metal shavings glitter in the screw slots, and there is a faint residue of glass polish, benzoin and spirit, a continental preparation not commonly used in English households. From his waistcoat pocket, Holmes produced his tweezers and carefully extracted something from the gap beneath the door. "Silk thread grey of excellent quality," he announced, depositing the filament in his notebook. "And here, upon the bolt mechanism, that same graphite lubricant we observed earlier, applied with careful precision." Lestrade watched these proceedings with growing impatience. "All very interesting, Mr. Holmes, but how does any of this explain how a murderer entered and left a sealed room?" Holmes did not reply immediately, but moved to peer through the keyhole. From this vantage point, the mirror dominated the view, reflecting the entire study with crystalline clarity. "The housemaid's observation point," he murmured. "From here, one would have an excellent view of the mirror's surface, though the desk itself would be partially obscured." Returning to the desk, Holmes examined the scattered correspondence with rapid attention. Among the papers, I noticed the corner of what appeared to be a visiting card protruding from beneath the blotter. Holmes extracted it carefully. The lower portion was torn away, but the remaining fragment bore the letters Las Arec in a bold, angular hand. "Silas Rook," Lestrade said immediately, "dealer in curiosities. He and Sir Reginald have had their differences over various acquisitions." "Indeed," Holmes replied, though his tone suggested this revelation fitted some pattern already forming in his mind. He moved once more to the mirror, studying not his own reflection, but the glass itself, tracing patterns visible only to his trained eye. "Hillier," he called to the butler, who had waited in respectful silence, "I should very much like to speak with Miss Mary Saunders, the housemaid who claims to have seen Sir Reginald alive just minutes before the discovery of his body. Her testimony may prove most illuminating." As the butler departed to fetch the witness, Holmes remained before the great mirror, his sharp profile reflected in its ancient surface, and I detected in his expression that peculiar intensity that marked the moment when scattered observations began to coalesce into understanding. Miss Mary Saunders entered the study with a hesitant step, of one whose orderly world had been shattered by witnessing the impossible. She was a woman of perhaps 28 years, with the neat appearance and composed bearing that marked her as a servant of the better households, yet her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a well-worn handkerchief. Holmes observed her with that peculiar intensity he reserved for witnesses whose testimony might prove crucial, noting the faint traces of ash upon her shoes and the dampness at their edges that suggested recent lingering near a hearth. "Miss Saunders," Holmes began, his voice carrying that gentle authority which had so often encouraged reluctant witnesses to speak freely, "I should like you to describe exactly what you observed yesterday morning, omitting no detail, however trivial it may seem. Pray take this chair where you may be comfortable." He positioned her so that she faced the great mirror, and I observed how her eyes were drawn inevitably to its silvered surface, as though the glass itself commanded attention. She swallowed nervously before beginning her account. "It was just after 8 o'clock, sir, when I was polishing the brass fixtures in the corridor. I heard Sir Reginald moving about in his study, which was nothing unusual, as he was always an early riser and preferred to work before breakfast. But as I passed the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar, which was most uncommon. Sir Reginald valued his privacy above all else and always kept the study firmly locked when he was working." Holmes nodded encouragingly, positioning himself near the keyhole where the maid would have stood. "And what prompted you to look through the opening?" "Concern for his welfare, sir. He had seemed troubled these past few days, ever since that gentleman called about the mirror." I glanced through the keyhole and saw Sir Reginald standing before the great glass, admiring his reflection as he sometimes did. He was wearing his burgundy smoking jacket with the gold braid, and he appeared to be adjusting something at his throat. He looked quite well, sir, quite alive and natural, though there was something about his posture that seemed different, stiffer perhaps than his usual manner. "You are certain of the time?" Holmes inquired, moving to examine the small clock upon the mantelpiece. "Quite certain, sir. The church bells had just finished chiming the hour." Holmes consulted his pocket watch and compared it to the mantel clock with characteristic precision. "This timepiece runs 7 minutes slow," he observed quietly to me. "If Miss Saunders judged by this clock, we must adjust our timeline accordingly." Returning his attention to the witness, Holmes continued his methodical questioning. "After you observed Sir Reginald in the mirror, what did you do next?" "I continued with my duties, sir. I finished the brass in the corridor, and then went to prepare the morning tea service. It couldn't have been more than 5 minutes later, when Mr. Hillier began knocking at the study door, calling for Sir Reginald. When there was no response, he fetched the footman, and they forced the door." Lestrade stepped forward impatiently. "And when the door was broken down, there was Sir Reginald dead at his desk, wearing his brown tweed suit instead of the burgundy smoking jacket. How do you explain that contradiction, Miss Saunders?" The housemaid's face grew pale. "I cannot explain it, Inspector. I know what I saw, and I saw Sir Reginald alive and standing before that mirror in his burgundy jacket. The jacket now hangs properly in his dressing room, exactly where it should be." Holmes had moved to study the mirror's ornate frame with his magnifying glass, tracing patterns visible only to his trained eye. "Miss Saunders, when you observed Sir Reginald in the mirror, did you notice anything else reflected in the glass? Any movement or shadows that seemed out of place?" She considered this carefully. "Now that you mention it, sir, there seemed to be a slight disturbance near the window curtains, as if a draught had stirred them, and I thought I glimpsed something dark move behind Sir Reginald's reflection, very quick, like a shadow passing, but it was only for an instant, and I thought it was merely the fog playing tricks with the light." After dismissing Miss Saunders with thanks for her cooperation, Holmes began another methodical examination of the room, this time focusing upon the area near the window curtains. Using his magnifying glass, he studied the carpet with minute attention, occasionally making small marks in his notebook. "Observe, Watson," he said, indicating a barely visible track in the carpet fibers. "Something has been dragged across this floor, disturbing the dust pattern in a narrow line that leads directly toward the mirror." Lestrade, who had been growing increasingly impatient with these minutiae, produced the torn visiting card from his notebook. "All very interesting, Mr. Holmes, but we have concrete evidence pointing to our culprit. This card belongs to Silas Rook, a dealer in curiosities who has had numerous disputes with Sir Reginald over various acquisitions. My men have already established that Rook left his residence yesterday morning despite claiming to be ill, and his housekeeper noted he returned agitated and smelling of foreign tobacco." "Turkish tobacco, I presume?" Holmes murmured, his gaze drifting toward the fireplace where traces of the expensive Yaniji blend still lingered. "Precisely. And according to the housekeeper, Rook is a tall, gaunt man with a pronounced stoop, which matches Miss Saunders's description of the shadow she glimpsed in the mirror." I felt a distinct sense of relief that this impossible case might, after all, have a straightforward solution. "The evidence does seem rather conclusive, Holmes. Motive, opportunity, and physical evidence all point to Rook." Holmes, however, remained before the great mirror, his sharp profile reflected in its ancient surface. "Too conclusive, perhaps, Watson. Consider how perfectly the pieces align. A rival who conveniently leaves his calling card, an alibi that falls apart under scrutiny, and a witness who sees precisely the shadow we need to complete our case. It is almost as if someone wished us to reach this exact conclusion." He ran his gloved hand along the mirror's ornate frame, pausing at a point where his fingers detected something my eyes could not perceive. "This mirror, gentlemen, is not merely a witness to our crime, but an active participant in an elaborate deception. The fresh scratches on the floor, the recently adjusted mounting brackets, the silk thread we discovered. These speak not of a simple murder, but of a carefully orchestrated performance designed to lead us down a predetermined path." His eyes, sharp and penetrating, fixed upon a particular section of the frame where his examination had revealed what appeared to be a small brass fitting concealed within the ornate scrollwork. "Silas Rook may well be involved in this affair, but I suspect he is merely another piece in a far more complex game. The true architect of this impossibility remains hidden behind the very reflections we have been studying." As we prepared to leave the study to interview the obvious suspect, I sensed that Holmes had begun to perceive a pattern of deception far more intricate than any of us had imagined. The mirror that had seemed to offer truth was proving to be the greatest liar of all. Before departing Sir Reginald's residence, Holmes turned to the butler with sudden decision. "Mr. Hillier, I should very much like to examine the burgundy smoking jacket Miss Saunders described. Every thread of this mystery must be unravelled if we are to understand the performance that unfolded in that study." We followed Hillier up a narrow flight of stairs to Sir Reginald's dressing room, where the deceased's effects were arranged with military precision. The butler opened a mahogany wardrobe and withdrew the burgundy smoking jacket with its distinctive gold braid. Holmes received it with the reverence of a curator handling a priceless manuscript, laying it carefully across the bed and examining every fibre with his magnifying glass. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, indicating subtle distortions in the fabric. "These pinpricks along the lapel where the gold braid is slightly raised. Not the natural wear of use, but the memory of pins. Someone affixed this garment to a form of some kind." He turned the hem, revealing a narrow band of dull wax transferred to the rich cloth. floor wax from the base of the Venetian mirror, and here—" He plucked a grey filament from the fabric. Silk thread, consistent with what we discovered by the study door. Lestrade leaned forward with growing interest. "A mannequin, then, dressed to deceive the housemaid?" "Something that could suggest the presence of a man when viewed as a reflection," Holmes confirmed. The deception lay not in what Miss Saunders saw directly, but in what the mirror chose to show her. Our journey to Bloomsbury carried us through London's transformation from elegant respectability to the cluttered vitality of the antiquarian quarter. The fog had begun to thin, revealing narrow lanes lined with establishments that catered to collectors of curiosities and dealers in historical artifacts. The very air seemed thick with the accumulated mysteries of ages past, and I found myself reflecting on Holmes's earlier observation about mirrors witnessing impossible crimes. Silas Rook's establishment occupied a narrow building wedged between a bookbinder and a dealer in oriental carpets. The modest sign reading S. Rook Antiquarian was almost overshadowed by windows displaying an eclectic collection that spoke to both refined taste and substantial means. Holmes paused on the threshold, his keen eyes cataloguing details that others would overlook. The fresh tobacco residue around the doorframe, the faint scratches on the brass handle, suggesting recent, perhaps nervous, handling. We were admitted by a thin, anxious woman who identified herself as Mrs. Pemberton, Rook's housekeeper. Her manner suggested one accustomed to unusual visitors and irregular hours, yet I detected an underlying tension that spoke of recent disturbance to her orderly routine. "Mr. Rook has been most unwell since yesterday morning," she informed us, leading us through corridors lined with artifacts from various historical periods. "Though he insists he is quite recovered now." Holmes paused before a collection of antique mirrors displayed along one wall, his gaze moving from piece to piece with scholarly attention. "Your employer has made quite a specialty of reflective surfaces," he observed. "Oh yes, sir. Mr. Rook says mirrors hold secrets that other antiques cannot preserve." Mrs. Pemberton hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "Though I must confess, some of his recent acquisitions have given me cause for unease. There's something unsettling about glass that has witnessed so much history." We found Silas Rook in a cluttered study that served simultaneously as office, workshop, and private museum. He was indeed tall and gaunt with a pronounced stoop, his pale features bearing the unmistakable signs of a sleepless night. When we entered, he was examining a small hand mirror through a jeweller's loop, but set it aside with obvious reluctance. "Inspector Lestrade," he said, rising with evident difficulty. "I had expected this visit, though I confess I hoped it might be delayed." Holmes stepped forward, his penetrating gaze fixed upon our host. "Mr. Rook, we are investigating the death of Sir Reginald Whitmore. I understand you had recent dealings concerning the Venetian mirror he acquired?" "I did express interest in the piece," Rook admitted, his composure faltering slightly. "It is an exceptional example of Murano craftsmanship, with a most intriguing history." When Lestrade produced the torn visiting card, Rook examined it with apparent surprise. "I did leave my card when I called 3 days ago, but Sir Reginald was not receiving visitors." Holmes had been studying a particular mirror near Rook's desk, its surface reflecting the room with unusual clarity. "Tell me," he said quietly, "what do you know of Venetian mirror makers and their more ingenious contrivances?" Rook's hands trembled as he adjusted his spectacles. Murano masters were devils for mechanical tricks, secret panels, adjustable backings, sliding frames. A concealed catch could transform a flat mirror into an angled reflector, doubling or delaying an image against a prepared backdrop. His voice carried a note of professional pride. I warned Sir Reginald that his mirror was built for performance. It lies twice, I told him, first to the eye and then to the understanding. Holmes's eyes sharpened with intellectual satisfaction. Performance? Indeed. And yesterday morning, Mr. Rook, when you left your residence despite claiming illness, where did you go? The question hung in the air like incense, and I saw our host's pale features grow even more ashen as he realized the trap that was slowly closing around him. Rook's composure finally cracked under Holmes's penetrating gaze, and he sank into his chair with the defeated air of a man whose carefully constructed defenses had crumbled. His hands trembled as he reached for a glass of water, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a confession long suppressed. "I was there yesterday morning," he admitted quietly, his eyes fixed upon the small hand mirror on his desk. "But not for murder, Mr. Holmes. I went to retrieve something that rightfully belonged to me, a manuscript on Venetian glass-making techniques that Sir Reginald had acquired through less than honourable means during our last business transaction." Lestrade leaned forward aggressively. "So, you admit to breaking into the house?" "The study door was already ajar when I arrived, just after 8 o'clock, Rook continued, his voice gaining strength as the truth emerged. "The bolt had been tampered with, lubricated with graphite, as you observed. But not by me, gentlemen. I brought my own lubricant, yes, expecting to encounter locked doors, but someone had preceded me." Holmes moved to examine the brass spanner more closely, turning it in the lamplight. "This Venetian key, Mr. Rook, you mentioned Sir Reginald had requested one. For what specific purpose?" "The mirror's hidden mechanisms," Rook replied, gesturing toward his collection of similar tools. "That particular piece was built for performance, Mr. Holmes. The Murano masters were devils for mechanical tricks. A concealed catch in the ornate frame can activate sliding panels, adjust internal mirrors, even create spaces where objects or people might be concealed. I warned Sir Reginald that it lies twice, first to the eye through optical illusion, then to the understanding through physical deception." "And when you entered the study," Holmes prompted. "I found Sir Reginald dead at his desk, the manuscript beneath his papers, exactly where I expected it to be. I confess I took it. It was my family's work, stolen from my grandfather's estate years ago. In my panic, I dropped my calling card and smoked a Turkish cigarette to steady my nerves before fleeing. But I swear to you, gentlemen, he was already dead when I arrived." Holmes had been studying the brass spanner with his magnifying glass, noting the fresh scratches on its surface. "Someone used this key recently and with considerable force. The metal shows stress marks consistent with emergency operation rather than careful adjustment." "There's something else," Rook added reluctantly. "Sir Reginald dismissed his long-time restorer just last month. Felix Armitage, a man of considerable skill with antique mechanisms. They had a bitter falling out over Sir Reginald's insistence on modifying historical pieces for theatrical effect. Armitage called it vandalism, Sir Reginald called it innovation." Lestrade consulted his notebook eagerly. "Where might we find this Armitage?" "Lawn Court, off the Strand. A shabby building with a cracked lantern. He's fallen on hard times since his dismissal and has taken to drinking at the Italians in the next alley. But I warn you, he knows those Venetian mechanisms as well as any man living." Holmes pocketed the brass spanner with deliberate care. "The timeline becomes clearer, Watson. Someone with intimate knowledge of the mirror's secrets arrived before Mr. Rook, used this key to manipulate the mechanism, committed murder, and arranged the scene to create an impossible crime. The question remains, what was the true motive?" Moving to examine Rook's collection of restoration supplies, Holmes noted the bottles of benzoin and spirit polish, the same continental preparation they had detected at the crime scene. You supplied Sir Reginald with these materials? I supply half the collectors in London, Rook confirmed. But that mirror required special care. The silvering was original, irreplaceable. I provided detailed instructions for its maintenance. As we prepared to leave, Holmes turned back to our host with a final question. The manuscript you retrieved, what specific techniques did it describe? Methods for creating perfect optical illusions using angled mirrors and hidden compartments, Rook replied. Techniques that could make a man appear to be standing peacefully before a mirror while actually being murdered behind it. The fog had begun to lift as we emerged onto the street, revealing the sharp outlines of London's rooftops against the grey sky. Holmes walked in contemplative silence, the brass spanner clicking rhythmically in his pocket as he turned it over and over, his mind clearly working through the mechanical possibilities that Rook had described. "Watson," he said finally, "we return to Belgravia. There is a secret locked within that mirror's frame, and I suspect Felix Armitage holds the key to understanding how it was used to create our impossible crime." Our return journey to Belgravia carried us through streets where the fog was finally beginning to lift, revealing London's familiar architecture with startling clarity after the morning's grey obscurity. Holmes sat forward in the hansom, the brass spanner turning endlessly in his gloved fingers, while his sharp eyes remained fixed upon some invisible calculation. The mechanical possibilities revealed by Rook had clearly begun to coalesce into a coherent theory, and I could sense his growing excitement as the pieces of this impossible puzzle aligned. "Consider, Watson," he said suddenly, breaking the contemplative silence, "the precise timing required for our deception. Miss Saunders observes Sir Reginald alive in the mirror at 8:07 by the study clock, which we established runs 7 minutes slow. The actual time would have been 8:14. D'Hillier begins his summons at 8:20, breaks down the Bourbon door at 8:25 and discovers the body. A window of precisely 11 minutes for our impossible crime." Lestrade shifted impatiently beside me. 11 minutes seems more than sufficient to commit murder and escape through whatever secret mechanism exists in that room. "But therein lies our fundamental error," Holmes replied with quiet certainty. "We have been seeking an escape route when we should have been examining the method of deception itself. The murderer never left the room because the murderer was never seen to be in the room." As we approached Sir Reginald's residence, Holmes directed our driver to continue past the main entrance and around to the mews behind the elegant townhouse. Here, a service alley provided access to the kitchens and servants' quarters, and Holmes studied the rear facade with methodical attention, noting the positioning of the study windows relative to the neighbouring buildings. "Watson, observe the angle of those iron-grilled windows. They would be clearly visible from the upper floors of the house directly behind. I believe we must consult with Sir Reginald's neighbours before returning to examine our mechanical mystery." The house immediately behind Sir Reginald's proved to be the residence of Mrs. Agatha Pembroke, a sharp-eyed widow whose morning room commanded an excellent view of the study in question. She received us with the eager efficiency of one whose observations had long made her an unofficial chronicler of neighbourhood activities. "Such terrible business," she began without preamble, settling into a chair positioned strategically before her window. "Though I must confess, Sir Reginald's recent behaviour had given me considerable cause for concern. These past weeks there have been the most unusual activities in that study. Lights at odd hours, shadows moving about when the house should have been perfectly quiet." Holmes positioned himself at her window, studying the angle of observation with characteristic precision. "Yesterday morning, Mrs. Pembroke, did you witness anything unusual in Sir Reginald's study?" "Indeed I did, Mr. Holmes. Just after 8 o'clock I observed Sir Reginald standing before that enormous mirror of his, but something seemed decidedly wrong. His movements were far too rigid, too mechanical, as though he were a marionette rather than a living man. And there was someone else in the room, a tall, thin figure moving behind the mirror itself, though how such a thing could be possible, I cannot begin to imagine. Holmes's voice carried a note of intense satisfaction. "Behind the mirror, you say? You are absolutely certain of this detail?" "Quite certain, Mr. Holmes. The figure appeared to be manipulating something within the mirror's frame, and Sir Reginald's reflection seemed to respond to these manipulations like a puppet responding to its strings. Most unsettling to witness, I can assure you." Armed with this crucial corroboration, we returned to Sir Reginald's residence, where Hillier admitted us with growing solemnity. Holmes immediately approached the great Venetian mirror, the brass spanner ready in his hand as he examined the ornate frame with his magnifying glass until he located the concealed mechanism disguised as decorative scrollwork. "Stand back, gentlemen," Holmes commanded, inserting the key into a nearly invisible fitting. "What we are about to witness is the mechanical heart of our impossible crime." With delicate pressure, and a turn so slight I barely perceived it, the mirror gave a soft internal sigh as though centuries-old breath had been released from its Murano lungs. The entire frame edged forward from the wall by perhaps an inch, and Holmes slid his practiced hand behind the silvered surface to locate a hidden latch. The assembly pivoted noiselessly on concealed hinges, revealing a narrow recess behind the glass, a space precisely the depth of a man's shoulders and the height of a coffin. "Observe," Holmes murmured, directing our lamp into the hidden compartment. Fresh abrasions on the inner wood where someone waited in cramped concealment, a smear of floor wax at hip level, and here, he indicated a tiny dark spot. Blood, no larger than a pin's head, at shoulder height where our murderer's clothing brushed against the wood. Within the recess, Holmes discovered the props of deception. A burgundy smoking jacket identical to Sir Reginald's, carefully pinned to a slender bracket, and a crude but effective mannequin head designed to create a convincing silhouette when viewed as a reflection. But the true genius lay in the mechanical system itself. "Watson, observe this secondary mirror," Holmes said, reaching up to depress a concealed spring. A narrow, oblique glass, hidden like a serpent's tongue within the frame, flicked into position at an angle calculated to catch and redirect images from within the hidden space. The Murano masters were indeed devils for such contrivances. To demonstrate the deception, Holmes arranged the burgundy jacket upon its bracket and adjusted the angled mirror with mathematical precision. "Now, Watson, oblige me by examining the view from the corridor keyhole." I did as requested, and gasped at what I observed. The study appeared perfectly normal in the main field of the mirror, yet there stood the unmistakable figure of a man in a burgundy smoking jacket, his head inclined as if adjusting something at his throat. Even knowing the mechanism was artificial, my mind initially accepted the illusion as reality. "Extraordinary," I called softly. "The deception is absolutely convincing." Miss Saunders saw exactly what she believed she saw, Holmes confirmed as I returned. The mirror presented not a reflection of the room as it existed, but a carefully arranged tableau borrowed from the hidden space and projected through optical precision. Holmes then turned his attention to the study door, examining the bolt mechanism with renewed understanding. "Note this minute perforation drilled through the bolt's tongue and the faint residue of graphite lubricant around it. A silk filament could pass through this hole, under the door, and into the corridor. With the door closed, a gentle pull would draw the bolt silently into its socket from outside the room." The mechanical sequence was now clear. The murderer had arrived early, concealed himself within the mirror's hidden compartment, and waited while Sir Reginald worked at his desk. The fatal blow was delivered with anatomical precision, the body positioned to suggest natural activity. When Miss Saunders passed in the corridor, the murderer activated the optical illusion, projecting the image of Sir Reginald alive and well. After she departed, the door was closed and locked from outside using the silk thread mechanism. "Yet questions remain," Holmes observed, moving to examine the scattered correspondence on the desk more carefully. From beneath the blotter he extracted a partially torn envelope bearing violet ink and a faint scent of bergamot. "Observe this feminine hand, Watson. Dated 2 days ago, it reads, 'I must speak with you before Armitage does something irretrievable. Signed only with initials, E.W. Lestrade leaned forward eagerly. "Another suspect?" "Or another victim," Holmes replied grimly. "Someone who knew of Armitage's knowledge and feared what he might do with it. The question becomes, who possessed both the mechanical expertise to operate this device and the intimate access necessary to prepare such an elaborate deception?" As we prepared to depart, Holmes pocketed several items of evidence: the silk thread fragment, a sample of the Turkish tobacco ash, and the mysterious letter. "We have learned what the mirror did and how it accomplished its deception," he announced. "What remains is to discover the hand that orchestrated this mechanical symphony of murder, and I suspect that hand belongs to someone far closer to Sir Reginald than we have yet imagined." The fog had lifted entirely as we emerged onto the street, revealing London's rooftops sharp against the grey sky. Holmes's stride lengthened as he hailed a cab, the brass spanner clicking rhythmically in his pocket like a clock marking time toward an appointed revelation. "To the Strand?" he called to the driver, then added in a lower tone meant for my ears alone, "When a mirror lies twice, Watson, the second falsehood is invariably the more dangerous. We are about to discover that this case involves not merely murder, but a betrayal that cuts far deeper than professional rivalry." Our cab deposited us at the mouth of Lawn Court, a narrow, grimy passage off the Strand, where the elegant facades of London's theatrical district gave way to the shabby gentility of struggling artisans. The air hung thick with coal smoke and the metallic tang of industry, while the cracked lantern that Rook had mentioned swayed precariously above a weathered archway like a weary sentinel marking the entrance to forgotten dreams. Holmes paused at the threshold, his keen eyes cataloguing the violet wax residue on the brick near the entry bell, a detail that connected this squalid alley to the mysterious correspondence we had discovered. The building that housed Felix Armitage's workshop bore the scars of better days, its once fine stonework now blackened with soot and neglect. We climbed a narrow staircase that protested our weight with ominous creaks, past landings where accumulated dust spoke of long abandonment. At the third floor, Holmes knocked upon a door whose brass nameplate had been recently disturbed, the screws showing fresh scratches that suggested nervous or hurried handling. Felix Armitage answered our summons with the weary resignation of a man who had been expecting this visit since news of Sir Reginald's death had reached him. He was indeed tall and gaunt with a pronounced stoop, but where I had expected to find a potential murderer, I saw instead a broken craftsman whose obvious dissolution spoke more of self-destruction than criminal intent. His once fine hands trembled as he gestured us into his cramped quarters, and his clothing, though clean, bore the careful mending that marked genteel poverty. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice carrying the hoarse quality of one who had spent too many evenings drowning his sorrows in cheap spirits. "I have been expecting you since yesterday. Sir Reginald's death was a shock, though I confess it was not entirely unexpected given the dangerous game he had chosen to play." Holmes settled into the single decent chair, while I remained standing near the window, noting the collection of restoration tools that spoke to Armitage's undeniable expertise with antique mechanisms. Several Venetian mirrors in various stages of repair lined the walls, their silvered surfaces reflecting our small party from multiple angles, creating an unsettling sense of being observed from every direction. "You speak of dangerous games, Mr. Armitage," Holmes observed, producing the mysterious letter signed with the initials E.W. "This correspondence suggests someone feared you might take irretrievable action. Pray enlighten us as to the nature of Sir Reginald's recent activities." Armitage moved to a cabinet and withdrew a bottle of brandy, his hands shaking as he poured himself a generous measure. Sir Reginald had become obsessed with theatrical applications for antique mechanisms. He wanted to modify priceless historical pieces to create stage illusions, to turn 300-year-old Murano masterpieces into carnival tricks. When I refused to participate in such vandalism, he dismissed me and sought other craftsmen willing to prostitute their skills for his gold. "Yet someone approached you after your dismissal," Holmes pressed gently, noting how Armitage's gaze kept drifting to the letter in violet ink. "Someone who shared your concerns about Sir Reginald's modifications." The craftsman's face grew pale as recognition dawned. "Emma Whitmore, Sir Reginald's niece. She came to me 3 weeks ago expressing deep concern for her uncle's latest innovations. Said she feared not only for his reputation, but for his safety. Given his recklessness with such delicate mechanisms, she was quite insistent on understanding the mirror's full capabilities." Holmes leaned forward with renewed interest. "Miss Whitmore possesses knowledge of antique mechanisms herself?" "Emma has an intuitive understanding of optical mechanics that rivals any trained craftsman," Armitage admitted with obvious reluctance. "Her small hands could reach hidden catches that defeated my larger fingers, and her patience with delicate adjustments was remarkable. Sir Reginald often said she had inherited the family talent for understanding the secrets that old mirrors keep. She assisted me with several restoration projects before my dismissal made such collaboration impossible." The implications of this revelation settled upon our gathering like fog creeping through London's streets. Holmes rose and moved to examine Armitage's collection of specialized tools, noting the conspicuous absence of the brass spanners typically used for Venetian mechanisms. "Mr. Armitage, I believe Miss Whitmore requested more than mere understanding of the mirror's capabilities. Did she not ask you to demonstrate the specific techniques required to operate its hidden mechanisms?" Armitage buried his face in his hands, the picture of a man consumed by guilt and regret. "She was so charming, so persuasive, and I was so bitter, so eager to see Sir Reginald humbled. She suggested that if I were to demonstrate the full potential of the mirror's deceptions, it might convince her uncle to cease his foolish modifications. She even provided me with a brass spanner, claiming it was her uncle's, and he had misplaced it." "And you showed her everything," Holmes concluded quietly. "How to operate the angled mirror, how to rig the mannequin, how to thread a line through the bolt mechanism to create the illusion of a room locked from within." "I thought I was aiding a harmless prank," Armitage whispered, his voice breaking with the weight of realization. "A lesson to make Sir Reginald see the folly of his ways. She was very particular about the technical details, insisted on understanding the precise timing required, the exact positioning of the optical elements. She even specified that the bolt mechanism needed to operate silently, requesting graphite lubricant rather than oil." Lestrade stepped forward impatiently. "So, you admit to providing the means for murder?" "I provided the means for an illusion," Armitage protested desperately. "I never imagined she intended violence." When she left that evening, she thanked me for helping her preserve her uncle's reputation and promised that no harm would come to him. Holmes had been studying a partially completed restoration project on Armitage's workbench, noting the meticulous craftsmanship despite the craftsman's obvious distress. The Turkish tobacco residue we discovered in Sir Reginald's study. You mentioned Miss Whitmore's visits. Did she smoke? Never in my presence, Armitage replied, confusion evident in his voice. She was most particular about avoiding any scents that might linger on her clothing, said her charitable work required her to maintain an impeccable reputation. Most interesting, Holmes murmured, pocketing several items of evidence from the workbench. Mr. Armitage, I believe you have been as much a victim of deception as Sir Reginald himself. Miss Whitmore used your expertise and your bitterness to acquire the technical knowledge necessary for her crime, while simultaneously creating a trail of evidence that would lead suspicion away from herself. As we prepared to leave Armitage's modest quarters, Holmes paused at the threshold. One final question. When Miss Whitmore departed after your demonstration, did she mention any other associates or collaborators in her plan to preserve her uncle's reputation? Armitage considered this carefully, his brow furrowed with the effort of recollection. She did mention someone else who shared her concerns, a gentleman who understood the true value of Sir Reginald's collection and wished to see it preserved intact. She said this person had connections that could ensure Sir Reginald's reputation remained unblemished, whatever measures proved necessary. A gentleman who smokes Turkish tobacco, perhaps? Holmes suggested. She never specified, but now that you mention it, there was a faint scent of expensive tobacco about her clothing when she left, as if she had recently been in close conversation with someone who favored foreign blends. As we descended the creaking stairs to the street, Holmes's expression carried that peculiar mixture of satisfaction and grim determination that marked the approach of a case's resolution. The mechanical mystery of the impossible crime had been solved, but the human mystery of motive and conspiracy was revealing layers of complexity that transformed our investigation from a puzzle of physics into a web of calculated betrayal. "To Kensington, Watson," Holmes announced as we hailed a cab. "It is time we met Miss Emma Whitmore and learned what secrets she has been keeping behind her charitable facade. I suspect we shall discover that this case involves not merely the murder of Sir Reginald, but the systematic destruction of everything he held dear by the one person he trusted above all others, aided by a confederate whose identity may prove the most shocking revelation of all." The journey to Kensington carried us through London's transformation, from the grimy industrialism of Lawn Court to the refined elegance of tree-lined avenues where respectability masked darker secrets. Holmes sat in contemplative silence, occasionally withdrawing the violet-inked letter from his pocket to examine it under the cab's dim interior light. His sharp profile was etched against the window as he assembled the final elements of what had evolved far beyond a mere locked-room mystery into an elaborate conspiracy of betrayal and calculated murder. "Consider the extraordinary patience required for this deception, Watson," he said suddenly, breaking the meditative quiet. Miss Whitmore approached Armitage weeks before the crime, cultivating his bitterness and extracting technical knowledge under the guise of family concern. She then coordinated with her confederate to ensure Sir Reginald would be alone at precisely the right moment, with the mirror's mechanisms prepared and the door's bolt system modified. This speaks to planning that extends far beyond simple inheritance greed into something far more calculating. Lestrade shifted beside me, consulting his notebook with growing unease. "If Miss Whitmore is indeed our culprit, she's had ample time to destroy evidence or flee the country. Why haven't we moved more swiftly?" because, my dear Lestrade, we are dealing with someone who has demonstrated remarkable cunning in creating false trails and misdirection. Approach her with incomplete understanding, and she will simply activate another layer of deception. Better to arrive with complete knowledge of her methods and the identity of her confederate. The Kensington address proved to be an elegant Georgian residence set back from the street behind wrought iron railings and a meticulously maintained garden. A clipped plane tree stood sentinel before the entrance, while a conservatory glimmered faintly green beyond the drawing-room windows. Holmes paused at the gate, his keen eyes noting the fresh gravel on the drive and the faint trace of violet wax pressed into a seam of the door's panelling where a gloved thumb might have rested. We were admitted by a grave middle-aged housekeeper whose manner suggested long and faithful service. When we requested an audience with Miss Whitmore, her expression grew troubled, but she led us into an elegantly appointed drawing-room where tasteful furnishings spoke of refined sensibilities rather than ostentatious wealth. Emma Whitmore entered with the composed grace of a woman accustomed to managing charitable committees and social obligations. She was perhaps 28 years of age, with intelligent grey eyes and refined features that would have marked her as a lady of breeding in any drawing-room in London. Yet Holmes's trained observation immediately catalogued the subtle signs of guilt, the faint discoloration beneath her fingernails that suggested recent contact with metal polish, the almost imperceptible scent of Turkish tobacco clinging to her dark mourning dress, and most tellingly, the slight tremor in her hands that spoke of carefully controlled, nervous tension. "Mr. Holmes, Inspector Lestrade," she greeted us, her voice carrying that cultivated modulation that marked her as a member of the educated classes. "This is indeed a distressing time. My uncle's death has left our entire family in a state of profound shock." Holmes settled into the chair she indicated, his penetrating gaze cataloguing every detail of her appearance and surroundings. On a small table by the window lay a pasteboard case of visiting cards, one of which had caught his attention the instant we entered by its slight protrusion from the others. "Miss Whitmore, I believe your uncle's recent activities had begun to cause you considerable concern." Holmes began with that gentle authority that had so often encouraged reluctant witnesses to reveal crucial information. His modifications of historical pieces for theatrical purposes must have seemed a betrayal of everything you both held sacred. For the first time, her composed facade flickered, and I detected genuine emotion beneath her carefully maintained exterior. "Uncle Reginald had become obsessed with commercial applications for his collection, Mr. Holmes. He spoke of partnering with theatrical producers, of turning priceless artifacts into stage properties. But there was something far more troubling. He had begun to contemplate leaving the entire collection to the British Museum in gratitude for some trifling courtesies. It would mean the dispersal of the Whitmore legacy, the loss of everything our family had preserved for generations." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying quiet intensity. "Troubling enough to seek technical advice from Felix Armitage about the mirror's mechanical capabilities?" The question hung in the air like incense, and I watched as recognition dawned in her eyes that her carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble. Yet rather than panic, I detected a calculating intelligence that suggested she had prepared for this moment. "Mr. Armitage was understandably bitter about his dismissal," she admitted carefully. "When I approached him, it was merely to understand the full extent of the damage Uncle Reginald proposed to inflict. I thought perhaps if I could demonstrate the mechanical complexities involved, I might dissuade him from such folly." Holmes rose and moved to examine the visiting card case, extracting the protruding card with delicate precision. Yet your visits to Lawn Court involved more than mere consultation, Miss Whitmore. You acquired specific technical knowledge, how to operate hidden mechanisms, how to thread silk through a drilled bolt, how to create optical illusions using angled mirrors and concealed compartments. He held up the card, studying its elegant engraving. And you did not work alone. This correspondence suggests a gentleman confederate, someone who shares your concerns about the collection's preservation and possesses both the physical capability to execute the violent aspects of your plan and access to expensive Turkish tobacco. At the mention of the confederate, Emma Whitmore's composure finally showed genuine cracks. Her gaze flickered involuntarily toward a framed photograph on the mantelpiece, a distinguished gentleman with penetrating eyes and the bearing of one accustomed to command. "You have been most thorough, Mr. Holmes," she said quietly, her voice carrying a note of resigned acknowledgement. "But I fear you attribute to me capabilities and intentions far beyond my actual involvement in these tragic events." Holmes moved to study the photograph more closely, noting the subject's military bearing and the subtle details that spoke to his character. "Your confederate, I presume? Someone whose presence would be marked by the scent of foreign tobacco, whose visiting card might be conveniently dropped to misdirect suspicion, and whose knowledge of anatomy would ensure a precise, fatal thrust." Before she could respond, we heard the sound of a key turning in the front door, followed by measured footsteps in the corridor. Emma Whitmore's eyes widened with barely concealed alarm, and Holmes turned from the photograph with that expression of intellectual satisfaction that marked the moment when all pieces of a complex puzzle finally aligned. "Ah," he said quietly, moving to position himself strategically near the drawing-room entrance. "I believe we are about to meet your confederate, Miss Whitmore. The gentleman whose timing throughout this investigation has proven so remarkably convenient, and whose identity will reveal that this conspiracy reaches into circles far more elevated than we initially suspected." The drawing-room door began to open, and I felt my hand instinctively move toward my revolver as we prepared to confront the second architect of Sir Reginald's impossible murder. The mirror's final deception was about to be revealed, and with it, the true scope of the betrayal that had transformed a family's legacy into an instrument of death. The door opened to admit a tall, distinguished gentleman whose silver hair and military bearing immediately commanded attention. Dr. Marcus Aldrich entered with the measured stride of one accustomed to authority, his weathered features bearing the unmistakable marks of service in distant campaigns. The faint exotic fragrance of Turkish tobacco preceded him like an invisible calling card, and I noted how his keen grey eyes swept the room with tactical precision before settling upon Holmes with evident recognition of a worthy adversary. "Mr. Holmes, Inspector Lestrade," he said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of the educated classes, tinged with the authority of command. "I had not expected to find you here, though perhaps I should have anticipated your thoroughness in this investigation." Holmes remained positioned strategically near the mantelpiece, his sharp profile etched with that peculiar satisfaction that marked the moment when all elements of a complex puzzle finally aligned. "Dr. Aldrich, your timing is impeccable as always. We were just discussing the remarkable coordination required for Sir Reginald's impossible murder and the extraordinary expertise necessary to execute such mechanical precision." Emma Whitmore rose from her chair with visible agitation, her composed facade finally cracking under the pressure of exposure. "Dr. Aldrich, they know about the mirror's mechanisms, about my visits to Armitage. We agreed this moment might come, but I had hoped our precautions would prove sufficient." "Peace, my dear Emma. Aldrich replied with the calm authority of one accustomed to managing crisis situations. Mr. Holmes has indeed proven himself worthy of his formidable reputation, but I believe he has yet to grasp the full scope of what drives men to such desperate measures. Holmes moved to examine the silver cigarette case on the side table, noting the monogram M.A. and the residue of expensive Turkish tobacco within its compartments. On the contrary, Dr. Aldrich, I believe I understand the situation with remarkable clarity. Your position as consulting physician to several of London's most prominent collectors provided both the anatomical knowledge necessary for the precise, fatal thrust and the social access required to coordinate this elaborate deception. Lestrade stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively toward his truncheon as the implications of Holmes's revelation settled upon him. Dr. Aldrich, surely you cannot be suggesting that a man of your professional standing would participate in such— I am suggesting nothing, Lestrade, Holmes interrupted quietly. I am stating facts supported by evidence. Dr. Aldrich's medical expertise explains the surgical precision of Sir Reginald's wound. His familiarity with the collection through professional consultations provided intimate knowledge of the mirror's capabilities, and his access to Turkish tobacco places him at the scene despite his carefully constructed alibi. Aldrich moved to the window, gazing out at the meticulously maintained garden with the air of a man contemplating the ruins of carefully laid plans. When he turned back to face us, his expression carried a mixture of resignation and defiant pride that spoke to the complex motivations underlying his actions. Sir Reginald Whitmore was systematically destroying one of England's most significant private collections through his theatrical obsessions, he said with quiet intensity. 3 centuries of carefully preserved artifacts reduced to stage properties for the entertainment of the masses. As a physician, I have sworn to preserve life, but as a scholar, I could not stand idle while cultural treasures were vandalized by their supposed guardian. Holmes nodded with the satisfaction of a professor whose student had finally revealed the crucial theorem. And Miss Whitmore's legitimate inheritance provided the perfect solution. With Sir Reginald dead and his modifications halted, the collection would pass intact to someone who understood its true value. Your role was to provide the physical capability that Miss Whitmore's delicate constitution could not supply. Emma Whitmore sank back into her chair, her hands trembling as the full weight of their exposure became apparent. We never intended for it to become so violent, Mr. Holmes. Uncle Reginald's modifications had already damaged several irreplaceable pieces. We thought if we could stage something that appeared to be natural causes, a heart seizure brought on by the shock of discovering an intruder, no one would question the circumstances too closely. But Sir Reginald proved more resilient than anticipated, Holmes observed, noting how Aldrich's jaw tightened at the memory. When the optical illusion failed to produce the desired cardiac response, more direct measures became necessary. Aldrich's professional composure finally cracked, revealing the passionate conviction that had driven him to betray his medical oath. He laughed, Holmes, when confronted with evidence of our presence, when shown the mechanical complexity he was so eager to exploit for commercial gain. Sir Reginald laughed and called it an elaborate prank. He said nothing would deter him from his planned modifications, that the collection belonged to him to dispose of as he saw fit, regardless of its historical significance. And so you struck, Holmes concluded quietly. A single thrust delivered with the anatomical precision of your medical training, angled to penetrate the heart while appearing accidental. The mannequin was then activated to create Miss Saunders's witness testimony, the door secured from outside using the silk thread mechanism, and the scene arranged to appear impossible. Holmes withdrew the brass spanner from his pocket, its unique teeth glinting in the afternoon light. This Venetian key bears traces of your skin oils, Dr. Aldrich, despite your use of gloves. The graphite lubricant you applied to the bolt mechanism required the steady hand of a surgeon, and the Turkish tobacco residue throughout the study speaks to your nervous habit of smoking while under stress. Aldrich straightened his shoulders with the dignity of a soldier accepting defeat, his medical bag resting forgotten at his feet, like a symbol of the oath he had betrayed. Emma sought only to preserve her uncle's legacy from his own destructive impulses. If justice demands a reckoning, the responsibility is mine alone. Justice, Holmes replied with quiet authority, demands the truth, regardless of the nobility of motive or the respectability of the perpetrators. The mirror's deception reflected not merely optical illusions, but the distorted reflections of those who claimed to love Sir Reginald while systematically planning his destruction. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor announced the arrival of additional constables summoned by Holmes's earlier telegram. As the net of justice closed around the conspirators, I reflected on the extraordinary complexity of human motivation that could transform legitimate concern into calculated murder, and the mechanical ingenuity that had nearly created the perfect crime. The Venetian mirror had indeed lied twice, first through its optical deceptions, and then through the false righteousness it had reflected in the souls of those who used its ancient secrets for such dark purposes. The arrest proceeded with the quiet dignity befitting persons of Dr. Aldrich and Miss Whitmore's social standing, though neither their composed surrender nor the constable's respectful manner could diminish the gravity of their calculated betrayal. As the handcuffs closed around Aldrich's wrists, I observed how his surgeon's hands, so accustomed to preserving life, trembled slightly at this final acknowledgment of how completely he had perverted his sacred calling. Emma Whitmore maintained her facade until the moment of departure, when the sight of her uncle's photograph finally broke through her careful composure, and silent tears began to trace paths down her pale cheeks. Holmes remained in the drawing-room after the prisoners had been led away, his keen eyes studying the framed photograph with that peculiar intensity that marked his deepest contemplations. When he finally spoke, it was with the satisfaction of a scholar who had successfully unraveled a particularly complex theorem, yet tempered by the sobering recognition of human frailty. "The complete sequence becomes clear now, Watson," he began, settling into the chair Emma Whitmore had vacated. Miss Whitmore, driven by genuine concern for her family's legacy, initially approached Armitage under the pretense of understanding her uncle's modifications. She extracted from him the precise knowledge of the Venetian mirror's mechanics, how the internal, angled glass could project images from the hidden compartment, how the silk thread mechanism could secure a door from outside, how the mannequin could be positioned to create a convincing reflection. Holmes produced his pipe and began the familiar ritual of preparation. Dr. Aldrich provided the medical expertise and physical capability that Miss Whitmore's delicate constitution could not supply. His frequent consultations with Sir Reginald had given him intimate knowledge of the study's layout and his victims' habits. Their original plan was elegant in its restraint. They hoped the shock of discovering an intruder, combined with the unsettling optical illusion, would induce a fatal cardiac episode, allowing them to claim natural causes. However, Holmes continued, applying a match to his tobacco with deliberate care, Sir Reginald proved more resilient than anticipated. When confronted with their carefully staged deception, he reacted not with fear but with amusement, dismissing it as an elaborate prank. His defiant declaration that nothing would deter him from his planned modifications pushed Dr. Aldrich beyond the brink of reason. In that moment of desperate frustration, with the mirror's mechanisms already prepared, he delivered the fatal thrust with surgical precision. Lestrade, who had returned from overseeing the transport, consulted his notebook with growing understanding. So the mannequin in the burgundy jacket was activated after the murder to provide Miss Saunders with her witness testimony? Precisely, Holmes confirmed. The body was positioned at the desk to simulate Sir Reginald at work, while the pre-prepared figure in the hidden compartment created the reflection Miss Saunders observed through the keyhole. The angled mirror within the frame projected this false image into the main glass, creating a timeline that seemed to preclude human involvement. The door was then secured from outside using the silk thread mechanism, and various pieces of misdirecting evidence were carefully placed: Rook's torn calling card, the Turkish tobacco residue, all designed to lead suspicion away from the true perpetrators. As we prepared to depart, Holmes paused to examine once more the violet wax residue that had first connected this elegant drawing room to Armitage's squalid workshop. The irony is profound, Watson. In their zeal to preserve the Whitmore collection intact, Dr. Aldrich and Miss Whitmore have guaranteed its complete destruction. The scandal of Sir Reginald's murder will ensure that no reputable institution wishes to be associated with artifacts tainted by such violence. Our hansom carried us back through London's darkening streets, past gas lamps flickering to life like earthbound stars in the gathering dusk. Holmes sat in contemplative silence, occasionally consulting his pocket watch as though calculating some final equation in the complex mathematics of human motivation and mechanical deception. A most instructive case, he observed, as we approached Baker Street. We began with an impossible crime and discovered instead a very possible conspiracy executed by individuals whose respectability masked the most calculating of intentions. The mirror's mechanical deceptions proved far less complex than the human deceptions they were designed to conceal. In the days that followed, events moved with inexorable regularity. Dr. Aldrich, confronted with the accumulation of evidence, maintained his conviction to the point of folly, confessing to the fatal blow while insisting Miss Whitmore had never intended murder. She, for her part, admitted to arranging the optical illusion and securing Armitage's unwitting instruction, but persisted in claiming that fear, not malice, had guided her actions. The courts would temper justice with understanding that tragedy had been born as much of misguided zeal as of avarice. Silas Rook, cleared of graver suspicion, returned his grandfather's manuscript to his safe with relief tempered by rue. At Holmes's quiet intercession, he received a caution rather than prosecution for his trespass. Felix Armitage carried the heavier burden of the innocent participant, though Holmes found him a small commission in restoration work, throwing crumbs of dignity where officialdom offered only condemnation. As for the mirror itself, Holmes arranged for its removal to a secure vault, its treacherous mechanisms bound and its hidden compartment sealed. He declined the museum's immediate offer of acquisition, remarking that no institution should exhibit a device whose primary attraction would be the memory of murder. "Let the glass cool," he said with characteristic dryness. "There are reflections a city ought not admire, while the blood is still warm upon its conscience." On our first quiet evening thereafter, Holmes took up his violin and drew from it a soft air whose melancholy sweetness filled our rooms. As the fire fell to embers and fog drifted once more about Baker Street, he regarded me with that distant gentleness he rarely allowed to surface. "You see, Watson, the mirror did lie twice. First to the eye, for that is the function of glass when pressed into service by artifice. But the second lie was to the heart, the comforting fiction that one may preserve what one loves by destroying its keeper. The most dangerous deceptions are often those we practice upon ourselves in service of causes we believe to be just." I ventured that his own reflection in the matter was singularly free of pride. He made a gesture of impatience that failed to conceal his pleasure. "The work had elegance, that is sufficient. Ring for Mrs. Hudson, my dear fellow. We shall have tea, and then perhaps you might read me that account of the Afghan irregulars you promised. It will be a relief to follow a campaign in which the enemy does not employ a looking-glass." As Mrs. Hudson's footsteps approached with the promised refreshment, I reflected that this case would remain in my memory not merely as an intellectual puzzle successfully solved, but as a sobering reminder that the human heart remains the most inscrutable mystery of all, capable of both the grandest passions and the most chilling betrayals. The Venetian mirror had indeed reflected truth in the end, though not the truth its creators had intended, revealing instead the distorted moral landscape of those who had gazed into its ancient surface and seen only the nobility they wished to believe existed in their own corrupted reflections.